The smell of freshly baked bread still hung in the market air when the bailiff's men seized Agnes by the arms and dragged her to the center of the market, before the whole village she had fed for 40 years. "There she is," shouted Osric Thornberry, pointing a finger that trembled more with ambition than indignation. "My own aunt, a debtor before half the village, hiding debts she can no longer pay." The creditors, 3 hard-faced men Agnes barely recognized, surrounded her, shouting for the parchments in their hands to be read aloud. The new king's judge, a middle-aged man with a face carved into a comb that revealed nothing, watched from the makeshift platform without yet speaking a word. "Widow Agnes of Thornberry," the judge said at last, his grave voice carrying over the murmur of the market, "you stand accused of unpaid debts to 3 creditors of this village. Do you recognize these documents?" Agnes lifted her face, still dusted with flour from the morning's baking, and looked at the parchments held out to her without understanding a single line of what they said. "I have never borrowed a single shilling in my life, my lord judge," she said, her voice steady though her heart pounded like a war drum. 40 years I have lived by my bakery and my labor, owing nothing to anyone but God." A murmur ran through the market. Osric stepped forward, wearing the expression of a man who had rehearsed his outrage all night. "The seals are there, aunt. The dates are there. Would you call honest men of this village liars?" The judge raised a hand, and the gesture alone was enough to fall a silence over the market like a slab of stone. His eyes, dark and composed, settled on Agnes for an instant that felt strangely long to her, as if he were measuring her against a standard only he could see. "Widow Agnes," the judge said, "until these documents are examined with the rigor the law demands, the bakery and the house shall remain in the custody of the council. Hand over the keys." Agnes felt the ground shift beneath her, though she did not take a single step back. She raised her hand to her belt, where the same iron keyring she had carried since she was widowed 20 years before still hung, and unfastened it with fingers that barely trembled. "May God enlighten you to judge justly, my lord judge," she said, holding out the keys. "It is the only thing I ask of you." The judge took the keys without looking away from her, and for an instant so brief that no one else in the market could have noticed it, something broke behind that mask of impeccable coldness he had worn since arriving in the village a week before. No one knew how to read that instant. Not even Osric, who was already smiling at the thought of the bakery soon to be his, understood that the man holding Agnes's keys had been, 40 years before, a starving boy she fed every dawn at that very door now closing. To understand how Agnes came to that moment, unaware that the man judging her carried in his chest a debt far older than anything Osric could have forged, one must go back several months, to the days when the bakery of Thornberry still smelled each morning of fresh bread and no one in the village suspected what was being plotted under its own roof. Before we continue with this story, tell us in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We're always glad to know how far this story has traveled. To understand the root of this betrayal, we must go back much further than a few months. We must go back 40 years, to a cold night when an 8-year-old boy, starving and hunted, knocked with bleeding knuckles on the back door of a bakery still warm from its ovens. The bakery of Thornberry had stood on the corner of the market square since before Agnes's father was born, its stone walls blackened by generations of fires, its bread scent drifting through the neighboring streets from before dawn. Agnes had inherited the trade from her mother, and her mother from hers, in a chain of women who kneaded before the cock crowed and gave the leftover loaves to the village poor without anyone asking. "Never let a child go to bed hungry if you have bread to spare, daughter," her mother had told her, many years before, marking a cross into the dough with her thumb before setting it in the oven. "This cross is our promise. The bread bearing this mark is always for whoever needs it most, and it is never sold." Agnes had kept that promise for 40 years, never missing a single morning, marking with the same cross the loaves she left by the bakery's back door for the beggars, orphans, and fortuneless travelers who passed through Thornberry. Few in the village still remembered how many lives that silent bread had sustained, given away before the sun had finished climbing over the rooftops. "You're too generous, Widow Agnes," Godwin the miller, who had sold her flour for 30 years, often told her. "One day that generosity will cost you dearly." "I would rather generosity cost me dearly, Godwin, than greed cost me dearly," she always answered, with a smile that admitted no argument. Osric had come to live under his aunt's roof only 5 years before, widowed from a wife who had died of fever, leaving him nothing but debts and a small son to raise. Agnes had taken him in without hesitation, offering him work with the bakery's accounts, for Osric could read and write better than she, who could barely sign her own name. "You are my sister's blood, Osric," she had told him then. "This house is yours too, for as long as you need it." At first, Osric had worked honestly, keeping the records of flour and firewood, collecting the few sales the bakery made outside its daily charity. But over the years, something had begun to twist inside him, an old fear of poverty known since boyhood that had, now that he was widowed with a son to feed, become a silent obsession. "My aunt gives away half the bread without charging a single shilling," he confessed one night to an acquaintance at the tavern, his tongue loosened by wine. "When she is gone, what will be left of this bakery, if she keeps giving it all to the poor?" "You could inherit it, if you knew how to make sure of it," the other man replied, a sharp-eyed clerk named Clement, who had for years sought a way to profit from his trade. That conversation, sown on a night of wine and fear, would germinate over the following months into the trap that now held Agnes standing before the new king's judge, without keys and without a bakery. Clement the clerk knew every ancient parchment in the village, every seal, every signature of the clerks who had come before him in generations past. He knew, better than anyone, how to age a fresh parchment with smoke and oil until it looked as old as the true documents in the council archive, and how to forge a seal with the patience of a man who had practiced in secret for months. 3 debts, dated 5, 7, and 9 years ago, he explained to Osric one night, showing him the parchments already prepared. "With 3 creditors willing to swear your aunt never paid for their share of the bakery once it is yours." "And what if someone notices the handwriting is not my aunt's?" Osric asked, a remaining shred of doubt that Clement was quick to crush. "Your aunt can barely sign her name, Osric. No one will compare a loan's handwriting to that of a woman who cannot write more than her own name. And even if someone doubted, who in Thornbury would dare call a council clerk a liar?" So it was that, month after month, Clement prepared the 3 false parchments, and Osric convinced 3 men of the village, themselves in debt and eager for a share of the bakery, to swear before the new judge that Agnes owed them some she had never touched. While the trap was woven in the shadows, Agnes kept rising before dawn, kneading the bread with the same weathered hands as always, marking the cross with her thumb onto the loaves meant for the poor. She noticed nothing strange in her nephew's behavior, save perhaps a silence that lasted longer than usual at supper, a glance that turned away too quickly when she caught him watching her. "Does something trouble you, Osric?" she asked one evening, gathering the day's last loaves. "Nothing, aunt. I only think of my son's future," he answered, and that reply, which in another time might have sounded sincere, already carried within it the poisoned seed of what was to come. Agnes did not press further. She trusted her nephew with the same blind faith with which she trusted that the bread would rise each morning in the oven, never suspecting that this very trust would be the door through which her ruin would enter. The day the new king's judge arrived in Thornbury, sent by the crown to set the county's backlogged cases in order, Osric knew the moment to act had come. A judge newly arrived, with no ties to anyone in the village, would be easier to convince with parchments made to look old and witnesses who could swear with a steady voice, than one who already knew Agnes and her reputation as an honest woman. "It is time, Clement," he told his accomplice, the very week the judge took up his post in the Guildhall. "Let us present the debts before anyone can warn the judge who my aunt truly is." Clement nodded, already calculating his share in the division of the bakery, not knowing, no more than Osric knew, that the man who had just arrived in Thornbury to administer justice carried within him a story neither of them could ever have imagined. Judge Walter Ashby had arrived in Thornbury with a reputation forged over years of service to the crown, cold, meticulous, incorruptible to the point of discomfort for those who expected favors. No one in the village knew his past, and he had taken care never to reveal it, not even to his closest aides. But that first morning in Thornbury, as he walked the village streets to acquaint himself with his new post, a scent stopped him cold at a corner of the market, the unmistakable smell of freshly baked bread, mingled with something older, something his memory recognized before his mind could name it. He approached the bakery without quite knowing why, and there, by the back door, he saw a basket of marked loaves, each one carved with a small cross in its crust. His heart lurched in a way it had not in 40 years. That same night, without telling anyone, Walter walked to the closed bakery and stood before the back door for a long while, memories of a starving, hunted boy reopening in his chest like a wound he had believed closed forever. He did not enter. He did not knock. He simply stood there, breathing the cold night air, until the cold itself forced him back to the Guildhall where he lodged. It was then, only 2 days later, that Osric and the creditors appeared before him with the forged parchments, demanding justice against a woman named Agnes of Thornbury. When Walter heard that name, something inside him stopped completely. He said nothing. He ordered the public trial to be convened in the market square, as custom demanded for debts of such magnitude, and prepared to preside over a case that, unknown to anyone else, would be the hardest of his entire career. If ever you have given more than you could afford, if ever your generosity has been turned against you in the hands of someone who claimed to love you, then you already know something of the weight Agnes carried that night, sitting in the house that might soon no longer be hers. But stay a little longer with this story, because sometimes the truest justice comes not from someone who loves us, but from a stranger who remembers a debt we ourselves have forgotten. Agnes did not cry that night. She sat beside the cold bakery hearth, her hands still stained with flour, and retraced in her memory 40 years of honest work, searching, without finding it, for the fault that could have earned her such humiliation. 40 years before, when Agnes was barely 21 and had just inherited the bakery from her mother, a particularly harsh winter night had brought fate knocking at the back door, the same door through which she distributed the poor's bread each dawn. Opening it, she found a boy of about 8, barefoot in the snow, his knuckles bleeding from knocking on doors that had refused to open. His eyes, dark and full of a terror no child should know, looked at her with the desperation of one who has already lost all hope. "They're chasing me, ma'am," the boy whispered, trembling as much from cold as from fear. "Lord Oswald's men. They say I stole, but I stole nothing. I was only hungry." Agnes did not hesitate for even an instant. She brought him inside, hid him behind the flour sacks in the darkest corner of the bakery, and when armed men arrived minutes later asking about a fugitive boy, she sent them away with the calm authority of someone with nothing to hide. "No child has come in here, gentlemen. Only the cold of the night, which punishes enough already anyone who walks these streets at this hour." The men left, grumbling, and only when their footsteps faded into the distance did Agnes bring the boy out of his hiding place and feed him the warmest bread she had, marked with the cross her mother had taught her to carve into every loaf meant for the neediest. "Eat, child. No one will harm you here." The boy ate in silence, with the desperation of one who does not know when he will taste food again, and when he finished, he looked at her with eyes Agnes would never forget, though the passing years would eventually blur that memory among 1,000 identical mornings, among 1,000 children fed at the same door. "What is your name?" she asked him. "Walter, ma'am." "Walter, son of no one." "Well, Walter, tonight you are a son of this bakery. Sleep here, by the warmth of the embers, and at dawn continue on your way before anyone else comes asking for you." That night, as the boy slept beside the dying embers, Agnes watched over his sleep, not knowing she was sowing, without meaning to, the seed of a debt that 40 years later would return to save her life. At dawn, when the boy woke, she gave him bread for the road and a small coin she kept for emergencies. "God guide you, Walter." And if ever you go hungry again, remember there are doors that open without asking anything in return." The boy left before sunrise, and though Agnes thought of him for a few weeks, wondering what had become of that small fugitive, the life of the bakery, the seasons that followed one another, the years of marriage and widowhood that would come after, eventually buried that memory beneath layer upon layer of new dawns, until it became just a shadow among so many other silent kindnesses she had given without keeping count. But Walter never forgot. In the years that followed, as a compassionate merchant took him in along the road and taught him his first letters, as he studied with a hunger for knowledge as fierce as the one he had felt that winter night, as he climbed step by step until becoming a scholar and finally the king's judge, he always carried with him the memory of a woman who had given him bread marked with a cross without asking anything of him, and a night of shelter that had saved his life. Back in the present, as Agnes retraced her own story without finding any fault in it, Godwin the miller arrived at her door, his face pale with worry. "Widow Agnes, I have heard what happened in the market. This is an outrage. You have never borrowed anything from those men." "I know, Godwin, but the parchments say otherwise, and my own blood upholds them before the judge." Godwin fell into thought for a long while, as the memory of 30 years of honest dealings with Agnes unfolded in his mind like a map that might, perhaps, point the way to salvation. "Widow Agnes," he finally said, with a determination that cost him effort to sustain, "I have kept a record of every sack of flour I have sold you these 30 years. If those debts were real, if you truly had stopped paying me for lack of means, my own records would show it. But my records say something entirely different." A ray of hope, faint but real, crossed the darkness of that night for the first time. The next day, Osric came early to his aunt's house, wearing the composed look of one who comes to offer comfort while hiding, up his sleeve, the knife he has already driven in. "Aunt, I know this is hard, but perhaps it would be best if you agreed to sell the bakery before the trial makes things worse. I could arrange to negotiate a good price, so at least you would have something to live on for the rest of your days." Agnes looked at him for a long while, searching her nephew's face for some trace of the boy she had raised in that house, some sign of her sister's blood supposedly running through his veins. "And do you believe, Osric, that I should sell what my mother and my mother's mother built with their own hands, for debts I never incurred?" "I only want to protect you, Aunt," he replied, unable to hold her gaze for more than an instant. That answer, so carefully rehearsed, failed to calm the unease already growing in Agnes's chest like a shadow just beginning to take shape. In the Guildhall, Judge Walter examined the parchments presented by Osric and the creditors with an attention that went far beyond what ordinary procedure required. His fingers traced the edges of the paper, searching for the signs of artificial aging his training at court had taught him to recognize in fraudulent documents. "Something is wrong with these seals," he murmured to himself, and none of his aides dared ask what exactly he had noticed. He said nothing yet to Osric or the creditors. A judge who reveals his doubts too soon loses the advantage of watching how the guilty behave when they believe no one is watching. And Walter, more than any other man in Thornbury, had deep, though silent, reasons to ensure that this time, the truth would not remain buried beneath false parchments. That afternoon, as the sun set over the rooftops of Thornbury, Walter walked again to the closed bakery, this time under the official pretext of inspecting the property under the council's custody. He walked the interior in silence, touching the same flour sacks behind which he had hidden 40 years before, breathing in the same scent of bread and warm ash that had marked the most terrifying, and yet most saving, night of his childhood. In a corner of the counter, he found a forgotten loaf, already hardened by the days, the small cross carved into its crust. He took it in his hands with a care no other object of his office had ever deserved, and for the first time since arriving in Thornbury, he let tears rise to his eyes, though no one was there to see them. 40 years, Widow Agnes, he whispered into the empty air of the bakery. And still you mark the bread with the same cross. If ever you have sown a kindness without expecting a harvest, without keeping count, without even remembering whom you helped, know this, that seed is never lost. Sometimes it takes 40 years to return, long after you yourself have forgotten it. But true kindness, given without conditions, always finds its way back, even if it takes the shape of a stranger who one day knocks on your door to return to you, without your knowing it, everything you once gave. The days that followed brought Thornberry a tension that thickened in the air like smoke from a poorly extinguished fire. Osric, sensing that time was working against him while the judge examined the documents with a slowness he had not anticipated, decided to accelerate his plan before something could go wrong. "Clement, the judge is taking too long to confirm the debts. What if he suspects something?" "No man suspects seals as well made as mine, Osric. But to ease your mind, let us speak with the witnesses again. Let them repeat their story without stumbling over a single word." It was then that Osric, desperate to ensure his plan's success, made the first mistake that would begin to unravel the whole edifice of lies he had built with such care. He decided to visit Godwin the miller, intending to buy his silence before he could testify at the trial. "Godwin, I know you have been my aunt's friend for many years," Osric told him, a purse of coins jingling discreetly between his hands. "It would be a shame if your dealings with the bakery's new owner became complicated by old loyalties." Godwin, a sturdy man with a frank gaze who had built his fortune honestly grinding grain for 3 decades, looked at the purse of coins with a contempt he did not bother to hide. "Keep your coins, Osric Thornberry. My records speak the truth, and the truth is not bought with silver stolen from a woman who raised you as her own son. Mind what you say, Godwin. Words have consequences, and not all consequences are kind." The threat, barely veiled, hung in the air between the two men, but Godwin was not intimidated. That very night, however, someone set fire to one of the carts he used to haul flour, making clear, without need for words, that Osric's warning was not empty. Agnes, learning of the fire at Godwin's cart, ran to his house with her heart tight with dread. "Godwin, this is my fault. I should never have let you become involved in this trial. Withdraw your testimony, I beg you, before something worse happens to you." "Widow Agnes," Godwin answered, with a firmness that surprised even his own wife, present at the conversation, "I have sold you flour for 30 years that you have kneaded into bread for this village's poor, never once charging you extra for the charity you give. I will not let a greedy nephew take from you what you have built, even if I must burn every cart I own to defend the truth." Godwin's words, spoken with the solemnity of an oath, brought Agnes a comfort she had not felt since the day of the trial in the market, though the danger hanging over both of them had only grown. Meanwhile, in the Guildhall, Judge Walter received news of the cart fire with an attention that went far beyond professional duty. He ordered an immediate investigation into the incident, without revealing to anyone the deep reason for his interest, and summoned Godwin to a private hearing before the formal trial. "Master Godwin," he said, when the miller appeared before him, his face still smudged with soot from the previous night's fire, "I have been informed that you possess records that may be relevant to the case of Widow Agnes of Thornberry." "That is so, my lord judge. 30 years of accounts, kept with the same honesty with which I grind wheat every day. Bring them before me at the trial. And fear not for your safety, from this moment, you stand under the direct protection of this tribunal." Godwin, relieved beyond what words could express, nodded with gratitude, not suspecting that the judge who had just offered him protection carried, at the bottom of his soul, a debt to Agnes that no record of flour could ever equal. That same night, the darkest of the whole trial, Agnes found herself alone in her house, with Osric absent for 2 days under the pretext of settling matters in the neighboring village, and the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her like a slab threatening to crush her entirely. She knelt before the small image of the Virgin she kept beside her bed, the same one she had prayed before every night since she was a child, and let the tears she had held back for days finally flow without restraint. "My lady, I do not understand why this happens to me. 40 years I have given bread to those who needed it, asking nothing in return. Is this the payment for such devotion? To lose my house, my bakery, my name, at the hands of my own blood? There was no immediate answer, no miracle to light the room with a supernatural glow. Only the silence of the night and the distant sound of the church bells marking the hour, a sound Agnes had heard all her life without paying it much mind, and which that night seemed, for the first time, a reminder that time carried on even in the midst of the deepest pain. At dawn the next day, her eyes swollen from a nearly sleepless night, Agnes rose anyway to light the ovens, as she had done every day of her adult life. She kneaded the bread with hands that trembled slightly, and when it came time to mark the cross onto the loaves meant for the poor, she paused a moment, wondering whether she would even have the chance to give them away before the council took the bakery from her for good. She decided she would. That as long as she had breath and flour, she would keep marking the bread with her mother's cross and giving it to those who needed it most, whatever the trial decided about her fate. That morning, as she left the basket of bread by the back door as she had for 40 years, she did not know that eyes were watching her from a distance, hidden in the shadows of the neighboring street. Walter had risen again before dawn, unable to reconcile sleep with the weight of what he was about to face. He walked to the market square with no clear purpose, letting himself be guided by the same instinct that had led him, 40 years before, to the door of that bakery on a night of snow and desperation. He saw her come out with the basket of bread, her back bent with weariness but her movements as precise and sure as any woman who had repeated the same gesture 10,000 times. He watched her set down each loaf with care, marked with the small cross he had carried in his memory since he was 8 years old, and felt the weight of the justice he was about to deliver become, suddenly, unbearably personal. Tomorrow, he said to himself, quietly, watching her return inside. Tomorrow the trial will reach its end, and the truth, whatever the cost, will come to light. He did not yet know, in that instant, that the truth he was about to reveal would not only be that of Osric's forged parchments, but also that of a personal debt 40 years in waiting to be repaid. The morning of the final trial dawned clear over Thornbury, a cloudless sky standing in strange contrast to the tension felt in every corner of the market. From early on, the whole village gathered before the Guildhall, eager to witness the outcome of a trial that had held the entire village on edge for weeks. Agnes arrived accompanied by Godwin, who carried under his arm a thick ledger bound in leather worn from years of constant use. Osric and the creditors arrived for their part with Clement, whose face betrayed an unease the clerk tried, without much success, to disguise behind a mask of feigned confidence. Judge Walter took his place on the platform with the same impeccable coldness he had shown since arriving in Thornbury, though anyone watching closely might have noticed, had they known what to look for, an almost imperceptible tremor in his hands as he arranged the documents before him. "Let the trial begin," he announced, in a firm voice. "Widow Agnes of Thornbury, you stand accused of 3 unpaid debts. Present your defense." Agnes stepped forward, with the dignity of one who has nothing to hide, though the fear of losing everything pressed on her chest like an invisible hand. "My Lord Judge, I have no parchments to present, for I never signed any document with these men. I have only my word, and the testimony of one who has dealt honestly with me for 30 years. Let the witness come forward," Walter ordered. Godwin advanced to the center of the market, the thick ledger open in his hands, and began to read, in a clear, steady voice, each entry corresponding to the dates the forged parchments claimed as the origin of the supposed debts. "On the date these men claim Widow Agnes incurred the first debt, my own records show she paid me, in ground flour and in silver, everything I had sold her that week, without missing a single shilling. The same holds true for the second and third dates named in these parchments." A murmur ran through the market. Osric, feeling the ground crumble beneath him, stepped forward, his face flushed with an indignation growing harder to sustain. "A miller's records cannot outweigh formally sealed documents, my Lord Judge. It is the word of a friend against the truth in writing." "Precisely for that reason, Master Osric," Walter replied, with a calm more terrifying than any shout, "we shall examine with care the truth of those seals you so defend." The judge then ordered the original documents from the council archive to be brought before the tribunal, truly ancient parchments against which to compare the seals and ink of those presented by the creditors. A trusted clerk of the tribunal itself, called specially for the occasion from the neighboring village, examined both sets of documents with a polished crystal lens under the watchful gaze of the whole market. "My lord judge," he announced at last, in a voice that left no room for doubt, "the ink on these 3 parchments is considerably more recent than what the seals of claimed antiquity would suggest. And the seal itself does not match the pattern used by the council 7, 5, or 9 years ago. It is a forgery, though skillfully made." The silence that fell over the market carried the weight of a sentence already passed, though the formal words had yet to be spoken. Clement, feeling every gaze converge upon him, stepped back, instinctively seeking an exit that did not exist. "Master Clement," the judge said, his voice heavy with an authority that admitted no evasion, "you are asked to explain before this tribunal how forged documents bear your signature as certifying clerk." Clement, cornered by the irrefutable evidence presented before the whole village, felt his legs give way. He looked at Osric, seeking some sign of support, but found in his face only the same panic he himself felt. I only did what I was asked, my lord judge," he stammered at last, his voice breaking. "It was Osric Thornberry who paid me to draft those parchments and age them artificially. He promised the creditors a share of the bakery if they would swear the debts were real." A stifled cry ran through the market. Osric, seeing his accomplice had just brought him down completely, tried still to defend himself with the desperate energy of a man with nothing left to lose. "He lies. It was he who devised the whole scheme, not I. Crossed accusations will not change the truth of the seals, Master Osric," Walter replied, without altering the grave tone of his voice at all. "And the truth of the seals has already spoken clearly enough for this tribunal." It was then, at the trial's culminating moment, that Judge Walter made a sign to one of his assistants, who withdrew briefly and returned carrying a basket covered with a linen cloth. He set it on the tribunal's table, before the astonished gaze of the whole market, including Agnes herself, who did not understand what relation that object could have to the trial's outcome. "Before I pronounce sentence," Walter said, drawing back the linen cloth with an almost ceremonial slowness, "I want this tribunal, and this whole village, to witness something I consider relevant to understanding what kind of woman widow Agnes of Thornberry is, beyond the lies that have today tried to bury her." Inside the basket was a loaf of bread, marked with the small cross Agnes carved each morning into the bread meant for the poor. He had it brought, discreetly, from the basket she herself had left that very morning by the bakery's back door, with no one but his trusted assistant knowing the exact reason for that request. "This is the mark widow Agnes has carved into the bread she gives this village's poor for 40 years, never once charging a single shilling for it. A woman capable of such silent generosity, sustained for 4 decades without seeking any recognition, is not the kind of person who hides fraudulent debts behind smiles of charity. She is, rather, the kind of person greedy men try to rob precisely because they know her kindness makes her seem vulnerable." Agnes, hearing those words, felt something stir in the depths of her memory, a recollection so old and faded she could barely make out its shape, like a shadow moving at the edges of a long-forgotten dream. "This tribunal," Walter continued, his voice now steeped in a final solemnity, "declares that the 3 debts presented against widow Agnes of Thornberry are fraudulent, fabricated by Osric Thornberry with the complicity of Clerk Clement. The immediate restitution of the bakery and house keys to their rightful owner is ordered. It is further ordered that Osric Thornberry be stripped of any claim to his aunt's property and be handed over to the council's justice for the crime of forgery and extortion. The clerk Clement shall lose his office for life and shall make restitution for the harm caused." A clamor of relief and astonishment ran through the entire market. Agnes, with tears finally breaking the dignity she had held throughout the trial, fell to her knees, not in defeat, but in gratitude, as Godwin held her by the shoulders with the loyalty of a friend who had never doubted the truth. Osric was led out of the market by the bailiffs, his face undone like that of a man watching everything he had built with years of lies crumble in a matter of minutes. Clement followed in silence, not daring to lift his eyes from the ground. The days that followed the sentence brought Thornbury a calm the village had not known for months. Agnes's bakery reopened its doors as usual, and the scent of freshly baked bread once again filled the streets near the market, as though the village itself breathed a sigh of relief alongside its most beloved baker. Osric was sent to serve forced labor on the council's lands for 3 years, as punishment for his fraud, while Clement, stripped of his office forever, left Thornbury in silence, with no one mourning his departure. The 3 creditors who had sworn falsely, ashamed before the whole village, offered Agnes compensations that she, with the same generosity as always, largely refused, asking only that they give part of their goods to the village's poor. "I do not seek revenge," she said, when Godwin asked her why she did not demand more punishment for those who had betrayed her. "I seek only that the bread continue to be given out each morning, as it always has been." A week after the sentence was passed, Judge Walter appeared at the bakery door at dusk, when Agnes was already gathering the day's last loaves. He wore simple clothes, without the formal trappings of his office, and his face had lost much of the impeccable coldness that had marked him throughout the public trial. "Widow Agnes," he said, in a voice that suddenly sounded much younger than his office would suggest, "will you allow me to come in? There is something I must tell you, now that justice has already been rendered and nothing I say can influence the trial's outcome." Agnes, surprised but without any fear, invited him into the bakery, where the warmth of the still dying embers filled the air with a warm, familiar glow. 40 years ago, Walter began, his voice broken by an emotion he had carried for decades. An 8-year-old boy, starving and hunted, knocked at this very back door on a winter's night. A woman hid him from the men searching for him, gave him warm bread marked with a cross, and told him that night he was a son of this bakery. Agnes felt her heart stop for an instant, as memory, awakened suddenly by those words, began reconstructing fragments of a recollection she had believed lost forever among 1,000 identical dawns. "Walter," she whispered, almost without voice. That boy was named Walter." "Yes, Widow Agnes. And that boy never forgot your face, nor your words, nor the taste of that bread that saved his life that night. When I heard your name and the trial Osric had brought against you, I knew at once who you were, though you did not recognize me." The tears Agnes had held back throughout the trial finally flowed without restraint, not from grief, but from a gratitude so deep she could find no words sufficient to express it. "That is why you conducted the trial with such coldness," she said, suddenly understanding the reason for that impeccable distance Walter had maintained throughout the proceedings. "So that no one could ever say you favored a woman only because you knew her. Justice that is not clean is not justice, Widow Agnes. Had I revealed who I was before passing sentence, anyone could have said I favored you out of personal gratitude, and the truth of your innocence would have remained stained by doubt. That is why I waited. I waited until the truth of the seal spoke for itself, until Clement confessed with his own mouth, until the sentence was so clear no one could question it." 40 years, my Lord Judge," Agnes said, wiping her tears with the back of a hand still stained with flour. 40 years I have given this bread away, never knowing what became of that starving boy who knocked at my door one night. I never thought life would return to me, in this way, what I gave then without expecting anything in return. That is precisely what I want you to understand, Widow Agnes, Walter answered, taking one of the day's last loaves in his hands, marked with the small cross that meant so much to them both. The kindness you give without keeping count, without expecting recognition, is never truly lost. Sometimes it takes years, even decades, to find its way back. But it always returns, in one way or another, to whoever sowed it with a pure heart. Agnes took the loaf from Walter's hands and broke it in two, offering him half as she had done, without knowing it then, that winter's night 40 years before. Eat, child. No one will harm you here. The same words, spoken 40 years later, closed a circle neither of them could ever have imagined when the coldest night of winter first brought them together before the door of that humble bakery. In the months that followed, Judge Walter remained in Thornbury, carrying out his duties with the same rectitude as always, though now, those who knew him well noticed in him a new warmth that had not been there before. He visited the bakery every week, not as a judge but as a friend, and in time came to become the son Agnes had never had, caring for her in her old age with the same devotion she had shown him that night of snow and hunger. The bakery of Thornbury kept opening its doors each dawn, and every morning, without fail, Agnes kept marking with a small cross the loaves meant for the poor, knowing now, with a certainty no doubt could ever break, that every loaf given without expecting anything in return carried with it the silent promise that kindness, sooner or later, always finds its way home. Godwin, for his part, became a formal partner of the bakery, and together, he, Agnes, and the judge who had once been a starving boy, sustained for many more years the tradition of that cross-marked bread, feeding generations of Thornbury's children who would never know how many lives had been saved, in silence, by that small sign carved into the golden crust of the bread. A full year passed since the sentence that restored Agnes's bakery in her name, and Thornbury, like any village that has weathered a storm, learned to live again with the ordinary rhythm of identical days, though no one entirely forgot what had happened in that square. Osric served his sentence of forced labor on the council's lands, cutting wood and digging ditches under the bailiff's watch, and when he finally returned to Thornbury, transformed by the hardship of his punishment, he presented himself at the bakery door with his head bowed and his hands calloused by work far different from managing another's accounts. "And," he said, not daring to raise his eyes, "I do not come to ask forgiveness, for I know I do not deserve it. I come only to tell you that my son asks for you every night, and that I, in my greed, have robbed him of the only honest family he had left." Agnes studied him for a long while, the same half-kneaded loaf still in her hands, weighing in silence the weight of 40 years of shared upbringing against the recent betrayal that had nearly cost her everything. "Your son bears no blame for your sins, Osric. Bring him here each morning, and I will teach him the bakery trade, as I did with you when you first came to this house so many years ago. But you, meanwhile, will work for Godwin at the mill, under his watch, until you have proven with deeds, not words, that greed no longer governs your heart." It was not an immediate or complete forgiveness, but the long and difficult beginning of a reconciliation that would take years to heal fully, yet one which Agnes, true to the same generosity that had defined her whole life, decided to offer without impossible conditions. Judge Walter, for his part, formally petitioned the Crown to allow him to remain in Thornbury beyond the usual rotation period for royal judges, citing reasons of continuity in the county's pending cases. The true reason, known only to Agnes and Godwin, was far simpler. He could not imagine his life away from the woman who had saved his existence 40 years before. Every Sunday, after the main mass at the village church, Walter accompanied Agnes to the bakery, and together they distributed among Thornbury's poor children the week's leftover bread, always marked with the small cross that had defined that extraordinary woman's entire life. "Do you know, Widow Agnes," he said to her one of those afternoons, as they watched a group of hungry children devour the last loaves, "when I was a judge at court, before coming to Thornbury, I presided over dozens of cases, passed sentences that sent men to prison or the gallows, and never once felt my work carried a purpose greater than the cold application of the law. But since finding you again, I understand that true justice is not only about punishing lies. It is also about protecting the kindness that lies try to destroy." Agnes smiled, with the serene wisdom of one who has lived long enough to see life complete its strangest circles. "Justice and charity, child, have always been sisters, though men often treat them as enemies." Godwin, now a formal partner in the bakery after the sentence, decided to keep a new record, separate from his flour accounts, a book in which he noted, without missing a single week, how many cross-marked loaves the bakery gave out to Thornbury's poor. He did not do it out of any legal necessity, nor at anyone's request, but because he had come to understand, after all that had happened, that the written memory of kindness could be as powerful as any proof in a tribunal. "Why do you keep that record, Godwin?" Agnes asked him one day, watching him carefully note the figures beside the bakery fire. "The bread I give needs no accounting. It is given and forgotten, as it should be." "I know, Widow Agnes, and I agree with you. But someday, when none of us are left in this world, I want someone to be able to open this book and know how much silent kindness sustained this village during the years you lived. Not so they might thank you, but so future generations remember that kindness, though it asks no payment and makes no announcement, leaves its mark just as surely as any sealed parchment." That humble, silent record became, over the years, an unintended chronicle of Agnes's generosity, a testimony no forged debt could ever match in truth or in weight. As the months passed, the story of Agnes and Judge Walter spread throughout the county, told from mouth to mouth in neighboring markets and fairs, each time with more embellishments and details than the original facts contained, until it became almost a local legend. The baker who saved a starving boy without knowing that 40 years later he would return to save her. Some travelers, drawn by the fame of that story, began stopping in Thornbury just to see the bakery where it had happened, and to taste, even once, the bread marked with the small cross that had grown so famous. Agnes received them all with the same humility as always, uncomfortable with the attention but unable to refuse bread to whoever asked for it. "I am no saint, nor do I deserve such fame," she would tell Walter, whenever some stranger arrived asking about the baker of the miracle. "I only did what anyone with a little spare bread and a little heart should do." "That is precisely why you deserve the fame, Widow Agnes," he always answered. "Because you never sought it." 1 year after the sentence, on the exact anniversary of the day Agnes had been dragged before the tribunal in the market square, the whole village of Thornbury organized, without her knowing beforehand, a celebration in her honor. The entire market filled with villagers, from the wealthiest to the poorest, all of them carrying bread they had baked themselves, marked, in tribute to Agnes, with the same small cross she had carved for 40 years. "Widow Agnes," said the village reeve, before the whole gathered crowd, "this village owes you an apology that words can scarcely express. We allowed one man's greed to nearly take from you everything you have built with generosity throughout a lifetime. Today, this bread you see before you is the promise of all Thornbury that we will never again allow silent kindness to be mistaken for weakness, nor charity to become an excuse for abuse." Agnes, overwhelmed with emotion, could barely speak words of thanks, while Walter, standing beside her as he had throughout the past year, held her hand with the devotion of a son who would never stop honoring the debt of gratitude he had carried in his chest since he was 8 years old. Over the years, Thornbury's bakery became something more than a simple family business. It became a living symbol of the whole village, a place where justice and charity, as Agnes had said that afternoon by the fire, reconciled each morning in the scent of freshly baked bread. Godwin kept his record of loaves given away until the day of his death, and his son continued the tradition after him, ensuring that the memory of that silent kindness would never be entirely lost among future generations. Osric's son, raised in part by Agnes herself during those years of slow and difficult reconciliation, eventually inherited the bakery when she, now very old, finally decided to rest from the dawn she had kept for more than 60 years of her life. And the young man, who had grown up hearing the story of his great-aunt and the judge who had once been a starving boy, made certain that every loaf meant for the poor kept bearing, without fail, the small cross that had defined 3 generations of the same family. Walter, for his part, remained in Thornbury until the end of his days, serving the crown with the same impeccable rectitude as always, but now carrying openly the unofficial title the whole village had given him with affection, the judge who ate from her hand. And whenever a stranger asked him the origin of that curious title, he would smile, his eyes wet with a memory he would never stop being grateful for, and always give the same answer, without needing to add a single word more. "Because a woman gave me bread when no one else would open their door to me, and 40 years later, God gave me the chance to return, even in part, everything she gave me that night." Chroniclers from the neighboring town, learning over the years of the fame Agnes's story had gained among the merchants and pilgrims who crossed that county, decided at last to gather the complete account into an official parchment, kept afterward in the council archive alongside Thornbury's most important documents, so that no future generation would risk forgetting what had happened. The clerk charged with that chronicle, a young man who had never known Agnes in person but had grown up hearing the story from his own grandfather, wrote at the end of the parchment a line that summed up, better than any other, the spirit of what had occurred. Let it be recorded, for whoever reads these lines 100 years hence, that in this village there lived a woman who gave bread without asking the name of the one who received it, and that Providence, with the patience of 40 years, saw to it that this bread returned transformed into justice. The custom of marking bread with the small cross, far from remaining confined to Agnes's original bakery, spread over the years to other bakeries across the county, until it became a tradition recognized throughout the region. Any loaf marked in that way was understood, without need for explanation, as a gift meant for whoever could not pay for it, a gesture of silent charity no beggar needed to ask for aloud to receive. Travelers crossing those lands for the first time soon learned, from the mouths of the villagers themselves, the meaning of the sign, and many of them, continuing their journey toward other towns, carried the custom with them, sewing it, without knowing it, in places far more distant than Agnes could ever have imagined her small daily gesture would reach. Walter, in his final years, devoted part of his time to instructing the younger judges arriving in the county, passing on to them not only knowledge of the law, but also a lesson he considered more important than any written code, that true justice demands patience, humility, and the willingness to examine every piece of evidence with the same rigor, never allowing oneself to be swayed by appearances nor by the social standing of the accuser. He told, whenever he could, Agnes's story as a living example of that lesson, though he never revealed, before the younger judges, what his own personal role in that story had been, preferring that they learn the principle before the anecdote. As the decades passed, when both Agnes and Walter had long since passed away and their stories belonged more to the village's memory than to the lived experience of those who told them, Thornberry's bakery remained, generation after generation, a place where justice and charity continued to be reconciled each dawn, just as that wise woman had predicted beside the fire, many years before, in a conversation she herself never imagined would become the most enduring lesson of her entire life. It is also told, among the tales the elders of Thornbury passed down to their grandchildren beside the winter fires, that many years after the deaths of Agnes and Walter, a pilgrim crossing the county on her way to distant lands stopped before the bakery doors, by then run by Osric's great-great-grandchildren, and asked why every loaf meant for the poor bore that small carved cross she had not seen in any other village along her road. The baker on duty, not knowing every detail of the original story with exact precision, but faithful to the tradition passed down through the generations, answered her with the same words repeated for decades in that family. It is the mark of a very old promise, my lady, made by a woman named Agnes more than 100 years ago, that no hungry soul who knocks at this door will ever leave with empty hands, and that kindness given without conditions always finds, sooner or later, its way back to whoever sowed it with a pure heart. The pilgrim, moved by those words, took the bread in her hands, made the sign of the cross before the small symbol carved into its crust, and continued on her way, carrying with her not only nourishment for her body, but also the telling of that story, which she would in turn share in the next town she visited, extending in this way, without knowing it, the echo of a simple Thornbury baker's generosity far beyond the borders she herself had never crossed in her entire earthly life. Those who knew Agnes in her final years often said they never once saw her embittered, not even in the hardest days of the trial, when everything seemed lost and the betrayal of her own blood weighed on her like a slab impossible to lift. She carried, they said, a strange peace, almost inexplicable to anyone who did not know the quiet depths of her faith, the calm certainty that she had lived according to what her mother had taught her, and that no lie of another's making, however skillfully forged, could ever change that inner truth. It was that same peace, more than any documentary proof presented before the tribunal, that sustained Agnes through the darkest weeks of that trial, and it was that same peace which, with time, the village itself learned to recognize as the true mark of a life well lived, not the absence of suffering, but the serene firmness of one who knows, deep within the soul, that she has always acted with clean hands and an open heart. Osric's son, raised in part by Agnes herself during those years of slow and difficult reconciliation, grew up among flour sacks and crossmarked loaves, absorbing not only the techniques of kneading and the fire, but also the quiet philosophy that had guided his great-aunt her whole life, that true wealth is measured not in coins kept, but in loves given away. Grandmother Agnes, he once asked her, when he was already old enough to understand the full story of what had happened before his birth, "Did you never feel anger toward my father, for what he tried to do to you?" Agnes, by then with hair gone entirely white and hands weathered by decades more of labor, took a moment before answering, kneading the dough with the calm of one who has learned to turn every daily gesture into a form of silent prayer. "I felt anger, child, and I felt fear, and I felt a sorrow that cost me much to overcome. But I also learned, over the years, that resentment is an oven that burns only the one who feeds it. I chose to keep kneading bread rather than keep kneading bitterness." Godwin, the faithful miller whose honest records had saved Agnes from ruin, lived to an advanced age, surrounded by the unanimous respect of the whole county, and on his deathbed, surrounded by his family and by Agnes herself, spoke a few final words that would remain etched in Thornberry's memory for generations. "I did nothing extraordinary, Widow Agnes. I only told the truth when the truth was needed. Would that every man have the courage to do the same, without expecting reward or fearing reprisal." His son continued the mill and the friendship with Agnes's bakery, sealing between the two families a bond that would last, according to the local chronicles, more than a century, passed down from generation to generation as a debt of honor neither family would ever allow to be forgotten. When Agnes finally died, by then very old, surrounded by the family she had rebuilt with patience and forgiveness after Osric's betrayal, all of Thornbury gathered to bid her farewell with a funeral the whole village would remember for generations. Walter, by then also advanced in years, spoke before the grave words that summed up, better than any official chronicle, the true legacy of that extraordinary woman. "Here rests a woman who never sought to be remembered, and who nonetheless changed the lives of more people than she herself ever knew. I am living proof that no act of kindness, however small it may seem, is ever truly lost to forgetting. 40 years it took God to return to this woman what she gave without conditions on a winter's night. May each of us, leaving this place, remember to carry with us the same generosity she taught us by her silent example, day after day, loaf after loaf, through a lifetime given to others." Thornberry's bakery, inherited by Osric's son and sustained afterward by successive generations of the same family, continued opening its doors each dawn for more than a century, and every morning, without fail, some hand weathered by labor kept marking with a small cross the bread meant for whoever needed it most, keeping alive, loaf after loaf, the silent promise a woman named Agnes had made to her mother, and her mother to hers, long before any judge, any treacherous nephew, and any starving child ever entered that story the whole village would come to call, with affection and reverence, the legend of the cross-marked bread. It must also be said, for those who still wonder how such wickedness could remain hidden for months beneath the eyes of an entire village, that Osric and Clement's deception was not the work of a single moment, but the result of slow, patient planning, built parchment by parchment, lie by lie, until it reached that apparent perfection which nearly deceived even a king's judge. Yet it was precisely this criminal patience that ultimately proved their undoing. A man who forges a single lie may perhaps get away with it, but a man who builds three, with 3 different creditors, 3 different dates, and 3 testimonies to coordinate, multiplies with each layer the risk that one detail, however small, will betray the entire structure. It was exactly such a small detail inked slightly darker on a single seal that brought down everything Osric had so carefully built over months of deceit. In the tales passed down by Thornberry's elders, there is also told a detail the official chronicles never recorded, but which the families of the region fondly handed down through generations, that on the night before the final trial, Walter could not sleep, and spent those hours pacing back and forth in the room where he lodged, torn between the desire to intervene at once on behalf of the woman who had saved his life, and the duty, which he felt as sacred as any religious oath, to let the truth itself, not his personal affection, speak in the tribunal. It was on that very sleepless night, the old village voices say that Walter finally understood that true gratitude toward Agnes did not lie in saving her through an act of favor, but in guaranteeing her a justice so clear that no one ever, in any century to come, could doubt her innocence. And it was also on that night, according to those same voices, that Walter wrote in his own hand a short prayer he kept for the rest of his life in a small wooden box, together with the memory of that first winter night, a prayer that asked God not for victory in the case he was about to judge, but only for the strength to judge with the same impartial rigor he would apply to any other case, without allowing his heart, however full of gratitude, to corrupt the purity of the justice he had been called to serve. Godwin, too, in the years following the trial, never stopped reflecting on how close he had come, out of pure fear, to yielding to Osric's threats and destroying his own records before they could serve as proof. He confessed more than once, in private, to Agnes, that on the night of the cart fire he had seriously considered abandoning everything and letting justice take its course without his involvement, to protect his family from the risk of further reprisal.
"What changed your mind, Godwin?"
Agnes once asked him, many years later, when both were already old and could afford to laugh at what had once been pure terror.
"My wife," he answered, with a smile lighting his weathered face.
"That night she told me that a man who stays silent before injustice out of fear is no freer than a servant, even if no one keeps him in chains. She said she would rather see me poor and honest than rich and complicit in silence." I never forgot those words, and I never again had to put them to the test, because from that day forward I always chose the truth, whatever the cost. That lesson, passed down alongside the rest of the story, became part of what Godwin's family taught their children and grandchildren for generations, that silence bought with fear always costs more, in the long run, than truth spoken aloud, however risky it may seem in the moment it is told. Over time, the market square of Thornbury, once the stage of Agnes's public humiliation, became instead the place where, every year on the anniversary of the sentence, the whole village gathered to celebrate what they had come to call the Day of Bread and Justice. The village children, taught by their parents the importance of that date, learned by heart not the exact details of the trial, which had grown somewhat blurred over the years in the oral tradition, but the essential principle the story preserved, that silent kindness, however long it may be tested, always finds its way, in the end, to being recognized. The bishop of the diocese, learning of the story many years later through the accounts of pilgrims, once wished to visit Thornbury himself to see the legendary bakery and its now elderly owner. He was deeply moved to find that Agnes, despite the fame her story had gained throughout the region, still rose before dawn each morning to knead the bread with her own hands, flatly refusing to let others do the work she considered not a burden, but her deepest calling. Many saints are remembered for the miracles they performed, the bishop said, during that visit, addressing the faithful gathered in the village's small church, but few are remembered, as this humble baker is, for the silent constancy with which they sanctified the simplest daily labor, turning every loaf of bread into an act of living prayer. Those words, spoken by a man of such ecclesiastical authority, only further cemented, in the memory of Thornbury and the surrounding counties, the reputation of quiet holiness that had come to surround Agnes's name, though she herself, until the last day of her life, continued to humbly reject any attempt to elevate her above what she considered simply her Christian duty. Even the three creditors who had sworn falsely before the tribunal found, some sooner than others, ways over the years to publicly redeem their names, devoting themselves to works of charity toward the village's poor, as though seeking to make amends, drop by drop, for the shame of that false testimony that had marked them in the eyes of the whole community. One of them, in particular, became one of the bakery's most faithful benefactors, bringing sacks of flour donated from his own purse every week, never asking anything in return, as if seeking, in his own small way, to imitate the very generosity he had once helped to slander. Perhaps this, more than any sentence pronounced by the tribunal, was the clearest sign of how deeply Agnes's story had touched the soul of all Thornbury, not only the justice rendered to an innocent woman, but the slow, quiet transformation of those who, out of weakness or fear, had allowed themselves to be drawn into the deceit, and who, in the kindness of the woman they had betrayed, finally found reason enough to change, truly, their own hearts. Many years later, when the direct memory of Agnes and Walter belonged only to the oldest villagers, a young scribe passing through, commissioned by a neighboring lord to gather the oral traditions of the region's counties, stopped in Thornbury on the very day of the annual Bread and Justice celebration. He was so struck by the story told to him, with so many consistent details despite being passed down only by word of mouth, that he decided to devote an entire chapter of his collection to it, titling it simply, "Of the Bread That Returns." He wrote, in the closing lines of that chapter, that of all the stories gathered during his long journey through the region, none had taught him so clearly that true nobility of spirit is measured not by blood nor by title, but by the constancy with which a heart chooses, day after day, to give without counting the return. That collection of traditions, later kept for centuries in the library of a regional monastery, survived wars, fires, and the whims of time that so often erase without mercy the memories of humble families, perhaps because the monks who guarded it recognized in that story something universal, able to speak to any heart in any age, that earthly justice, however slow and imperfect, is never the final word on silent kindness, and that every act of true charity, however small and forgotten it may seem to the one who performs it, leaves a mark that time, far from erasing, tends rather to deepen and spread, generation after generation, town after town, until it reaches ears and hearts the original doer of that deed could never have imagined touching. And perhaps it is for this very reason that, even today, whoever visits the lands that once made up the county of Thornbury can still hear, if they listen closely enough to the tales of the eldest, the distant but still living echo of a story that continues to be told, not for its strangeness or its drama, but for the simple and ever-relevant truth it holds, that no kindness given with a pure heart is ever truly lost, however long the road it must travel before finally finding its way home. May whoever hears this story today, in whatever land they live, find in it a reason to keep giving whatever little or much they possess, without expecting return, without keeping count, trusting that the same providence that watched over Agnes for 40 long years watches also, silent and patient, over every generous heart that today, in some corner of the world, shares its bread with whoever needs it most. Because in the end, when every forged parchment has crumbled and every earthly judge has already pronounced their final sentence, what remains are only the hands that gave without expecting, and the bread that fed those no one else would look upon. That is the one wealth no greedy nephew, no bribed clerk, and no lying creditor could ever take from a woman like Agnes, the quiet certainty of having lived, every dawn of her life, on the right side of the scale that only God, in the end, is charged with balancing. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this story. May every dawn find you willing to give away your own bread, whatever shape it may take, without fear that the world will be slow to return it. And so ends, amid the warm scent of freshly baked bread and the distant echo of Thornbury's church bells, the story of a baker who gave without measure, of a boy who never forgot, and of a justice that, though it took 40 years to arrived at last complete, clean, and true, like the bread that rises every dawn over the embers of a humble oven. May God bless you, and may you carry this story with you always. Come back soon for another story like this one, and carry with you, wherever you go, the quiet memory of bread marked with a cross. Amen, now and forever, world without end. Until we meet again, dear friend.